The EHC Podcast is back. Mike Hattery and I will be talking about the third base positional previews today, which means we're going to be talking about the one, the only, Jose Ramirez, where Mike and I will take our victory lap for perhaps the 2016 Cleveland Indians MVP. Before we get to that, we do want to talk to you about the WFNY Patreon page. If you haven't checked it out yet, if you've been fast forwarding through this, but you've made it this far today, what I want you to do is head on over to patreon.com/WFNY. Check out all the fantastic tiers we have to offer where you can get little trinkets of our appreciation for helping us provide you with fantastic podcasting content as well as the written content that we've been known for the past 9 years. Check us out at patreon.com/WFNY. Another quick and easy way to help the podcast out is to head over to iTunes to waitingfornextyear.com, the podcast, and give us a 4 or 5 star rating. Give us a quick review. While it doesn't seem like a lot, what that does is it makes our content more accessible so that people who haven't heard about the podcast can find us. Leave us a 4 or 5 star review. Check out Patreon. And without further ado, Mike Hattery joins me to talk about third base and Jose Ramirez. See, I promised I wasn't going to sing.
Welcome to Everybody Hates Cleveland, the podcast at waitingfornextyear.com. We're continuing our positional preview series. I'm going to make this sort of lead-in as boring and detailed as can possibly be enjoyed. More importantly, we have really cool intro music from my brother-in-law, Jonathan Becker. Today we get to discuss perhaps the most interesting Cleveland Indian, Jose Ramirez. And also I'd like to continue to sort of protest that Great Lakes Brewery has not made Conway's a year-round beer, but that's for another time.
Before we get going with this podcast, I have a question about Great Lakes. I had this debate a couple of nights ago with a friend of mine. Would you consider Great Lakes craft beer, even though wherever I go, driving home to Raleigh, North Carolina, I can buy it?
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of past the tipping point to mainstream beer in terms of the way that, like, Magic Hat reached the tipping point.
I mean, it doesn't take away from the fantasticness of it, but someone called it a craft beer the other day, and I guess we should probably pod about this at some point, Mike, but to me, it's beyond craft, which is a great thing for Great Lakes, of course, and every bottle I've ever had of any kind is fantastic, but I can, like, my local brewery, my local beer store now carries it, which is about a mile from my house in Raleigh, North Carolina, which has made my life, when I'm there, such a fantastic life.
Yeah, I mean, when I return to Dryden, New York, which is a very small upstate town, I've noticed that I can get a Great Lakes sampler pack.
But and I mean, I'm assuming, Michael, that breweries are kind of the thing there too, right?
They're not unpopular, certainly not as popular as the Cleveland area. We have a couple of microbreweries, but, to me, it's almost like as common as the Sammy Adams winter sampler at this point. I do think there's sort of a mainstreaming nature of where Great Lakes has gone.
And I guess
to say that they don't have phenomenal quality, but, and they have some weak years too. The Dortmunder is...
Well, I mean, is it that Dortmunder isn't good, or is it that I've had a lot of it? I've kind of moved on. But again, we should probably prep for a craft beer podcast at some point, because now I want to talk about craft beer.
Sounds good. But right now we're talking about my favorite prospect of the last decade, and now Major League Baseball elite producer, Jose Ramirez. And shockingly, this offseason, the conversation has been not whether Jose Ramirez will regress, but how much. And I think that's sort of anchored on the notion that a lot of people missed on Jose Ramirez. I think if he had Lindor's pedigree or had significant sort of prospect watchers, I think the conversation would be really different. We have a 24-year-old who had been productive at 21 years old in the big leagues. He just put up a really big season in 23 to age 24. And so I find it shocking how much regression people sort of expect and how much people don't really trust Ramirez. So what's the case for not trusting Jose Ramirez in 2017?
Well, before we get to trust or not trust, I think that the key to this conversation is understanding that the trust we're talking about is the people who are posting about it on Twitter and the media. And again, as you mentioned, Mike, the people who missed out on him from the time he hit 325 at low A, short season A. I think that as far as the ball club is concerned, front office and Tito Francona, they have trusted him from the start. I mean, we're talking about a kid who had never played AAA before, who had skipped high A, making the jump to the big league club. And we're talking Terry Francona, who loves his veteran guys. And this is a guy they pulled up on August 31st to avoid all the hassle of making the playoff roster. So again, when we're talking trust, I just want to make sure that we preface the fact that this front office and this management staff on the field and off the field have trusted him from the start. So let's start there. Now, regression. I mean, I guess the two pieces to this, Mike, are what you already said. People didn't expect him to have, a 312, 363, 462 slash. They didn't expect him to ever hit over 5 home runs, and he hit 11. He scored 84 runs. He was the absolute cog in the lineup. He didn't slump. In 2016, he was as much of a backbone of this team as anybody has been in recent memory. When people are comparing him to replacing Michael Brantley as the offense, big statements there. So obviously, I think that when you have a season that surprises everybody other than people that really pay attention to the club and pay attention to him as a prospect, I think obviously the gut instinct is to point out regression. I think if you look at, even the metrics of it, there's a couple of little things, maybe the BABIP, that may suggest a slight drop. But I think, Mike, I don't know that there's a tangible piece of evidence out there other than, well, he played really well last year, so he's going to regress. I don't know. I mean, this is a guy who's performed at every single level. The only time that he's struggled twice in his career, he struggled once at AA when, again, his skipped a level and then got hurt. If you recall, I think his first few months in AAA were kind of injury prone, and he struggled a little bit before kind of catching fire there at the tail end, which ultimately, by the way, led him to playing in the big leagues that same year. And then, of course, he started the year off as the starting shortstop, and anybody who reported the team noted that he didn't kind of have that same swag that he had in the minor leagues. And then once he regained it in the minors, he came back, kind of closed out the season in a strong way. Of course, the most memorable piece to that was the bat flipping incident in Minnesota. And then, of course, he came flying into, the season last year and basically had the MVP season for the team. So I don't know, Mike. I mean, I'm not making a good case for regression. I guess I'm kind of bantering back and forth with, he's not really going to regress, but this is, of course, you and me talking about Jose Ramirez. So I guess we're biased. I don't know. Let me give you let me serve you up the EFIS pitch here. Why is Jose Ramirez not going to regress?
Because he makes bucket loads of contact and good contact. That's why. Yeah, really, he improves his contact authority really fast. And you mentioned the BABIP, but it's a little high in the 330s last year, but it's not Tyler Naquin running 410.
I know. I mean,
he's running over 300 BABIP, right? He's super fast.
Yeah, well, those are the stretches, I'm like, you see 333 and you go, yeah, it's not bad. I mean, that could be it. That could be what he does the rest of his career,
If he ran like a 320 BABIP for the next 10 years, I actually think that's pretty likely. And when you don't strike out at all, it makes it really hard to hit below 285, which is a really good big league player, especially when you have 20 steals a year. Also, I've been doing this sort of deep dive piece that I find really compelling, which is I think we've sort of become too foolish when it comes to the concept of productive outs. Like the sabermetric community has sort of like shredded the fact that like no out actually has substantive value. But one of the really interesting things when you have a bunch of dudes like Lindor and Ramirez is even when they make outs, the lower bound, like the lower bound outcome of a double play is less likely. So you're eliminating like punitive outs that significantly decrease run expectancy. And also you have guys who are stealing about 20 plus bases a season, which means a lot of times they can go and improve run expectancy anyway. So Ramirez, his outs are even sort of like less adverse than most other players' outs because he gets so much value from contact. And the productive out thing, I think we've sort of crossed the line on how we evaluate players with productive outs. He makes tons of contact, which is way better in scoring situations. And just to appreciate his value, he was 11th in all of Major League Baseball in win probability added in 2016 among position players, which is super insane, in front of guys like Carlos Correa, Bryce Harper, Yoenis Cespedes, Robinson Cano, Miguel Cabrera, Mookie Betts, Nolan Arenado, and Jose Altuve. And he's just that valuable when he has runners on base because he can make contact to every field, which makes it really tough on defenses because when you have runners on, you have them pinching towards the runner a lot of times, which raises his BABIP. He's always going to punish teams with runners in scoring position because not only because he makes contact, but because he uses the whole field. And I'm going to toss it back to you because we do JRam love, but like he's finally going to be settled at third for a while, right?
Well, that's, there's a lot of places to go with this. I mean, my assumption is yes, for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously, there aren't really any replacements for him theoretically, although we're probably going to talk about a couple of them in a second. I think the Indians, I guess the big question for me is, and I can't believe I'm going to say this because prior to this season, this past season, I think I would have ripped someone's head off for saying this in a podcast with me. But I mean, I guess the question that I've been asking myself is value-wise, especially with this team potentially having some holes in the outfield, and we'll get to that in a couple of podcasts, but is his value at third base, or is his value as a guy who can kind of be that uber utility guy who can play at multiple positions? Because, of course, we already know he can play short. We already know he can play second. We already know that while left field can be an adventure, it's not the kind of adventure we're talking about with some of the other guys that we put out there because he can make up a lot of that with his athleticism. So I to kind of get back on point here, I think he is our starting third baseman. I think he will be our starting third baseman, although we are going to probably talk about Yandy Diaz here in a second, and even a guy like Giovanny Urshela, who's I don't know where he's going to be. He's not a legit guy to me at this point, but I think there are other options should the Indians decide that his value is to move around a little bit more, because he does seem to me, I think, Mike, most of the time when we talk about players playing a specific position, I think that's always a benefit. I think Jose Ramirez is one of those other guys. I think he's fine. I think he's got that attitude where wherever you put him, he's going to be fine with it. Not just, not Mike Avila's fine, like, thank God I'm playing, like, I'm going to play to the best of my ability fine, because he is I think an above average defender overall at whatever position he plays at. Now, this is probably where we get down to the nitty gritty, though, with him at third base. Will it behoove him to play third base the entire spring training and then go into the season as the third baseman? Absolutely. I think this is where we'll see him just be slightly above average, maybe last year, to above average. And that's probably the main difference. And I guess as I kind of volley it back to you, my big question here is, Mike, I think maybe the knock on Ramirez from an outsider looking in is that he's not a prototypical third baseman. And I think with the Indians struggling at third base over the years, with guys like Chisenhall there, and you can go through a variety of different guys that they've had there, Uribe last year, I think Is that a knock? Is that a legit outside of the organization knock? I mean, when you're looking at a guy, he hit 11 home runs last year. He's going to have the same kind of power. You want a little bit of traditional power there at third base, but does all of the other stuff. I mean, again, you're looking at a guy that's going to play over 150 games. You look at a guy who stays healthy a lot. You look at a guy who makes tons of contact. You're looking at a guy who defensively locked up a position. I just answered my question, right? I mean, he's not a deficient third baseman and that he's not a prototypical third baseman, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's like a rich man's Martin Prado, who's been a really good third baseman for a couple of years. I think that profile is really interesting, and certainly the guys in front of him. I mean, you have Bryan and Donaldson, Machado and Arenado, running into fastballs and hitting the ball out of the park everywhere, but there's also that room for the guy who's just makes a ton of contact, steals a lot of bases, plays good defense, and drives in a lot of runs and keeps rallies going. And I think I keep going back. I'm so obsessed. I was reading in the early offseason, there's this delightful Bill James quote about the fact that he thinks, he wrote about how the thing that we probably undervalue at this point in Major League Baseball is contact skill. And I think when we watched this offseason go, I think teams sort of adjusted for that, as we've seen guys like Chris Carter's looking for a job in Japan right now. Mike Napoli still doesn't have a home. Trumbo took forever and lost a significant amount of money. I think, we're sort of realizing that teams are readjusting to the value of contact added value in run scoring. And so I think that really in some ways highlights Jose Ramirez's value.
Well, I think I like looking at players and I like looking at comps. And it's funny because prior to him taking over third base last year, Mike, I think a guy that a lot of people were kind of starting to veer towards with regards to Jose Ramirez was, you mentioned earlier, a guy like Altuve. Now, obviously they play different positions now, whereas their initial position, second base, but breakout year for Altuve. And it was a bit of a surprise breakout. I mean, his breakout year was, I believe he had just turned 24 that year. And of course, if you look at the numbers, he had a little less power, 11 home runs to 7 home runs, runs very similar, 84 to 85. Stolen bases, obviously, I think Altuve had close to 60 that year. Splits a little bit different only because if you look at the slash, I think Altuve hit 340 that year than his breakout season. But overall, I think we're looking at a 5-WAR season for both. Maybe 4.8 F-WAR for Ramirez last year. And I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was 5-WAR for Altuve. When you're looking at that kind of, so here's my question. In the Indians organization, and this is where I get fried with Jose Ramirez, this is where people really piss me off. Jose Ramirez within the organization has always been a top 5 prospect, almost from the get-go. They've always looked at him as one of their top prospects. They bump him up over 2 levels twice. Is he an Altuve-type prospect? I mean, is this really what we're looking at, Mike? Because I think the Indians have looked at him like that from the start. I think they've looked at him, maybe not quite as Lindor, but I think they've thought he's been one of their elite prospects from the start. Just because the rest of the world misses out on him and are just now catching up on him, this really is the year where he gets to prove he's the Altuve guy. So I'm asking you, Mike, were the mirrored kind of statistics that these two put up legit? Are we going to see Jose Ramirez become our Altuve in 2017?
Oh, gosh. It's hard to project somebody to be like the MVP candidate, Jim? But yeah, I do agree with the fact that I think, you and I talk about this a ton. If you would pay attention to the Indians organization at all, you would have realized how much they valued Jose Ramirez in terms of constantly prioritizing him. And you covered the Carolina Mudcats for a while, and it's really, high A is a significant priority, and high A and double A, I think, are a lot of times the most significant measures of a player, and they just straight up skipped Ramirez from high A.
Nobody skips levels. Nobody. Jason Kipnis. Okay, and I only bring him into this because he was an advanced college bat. They never worried about his bat. And granted they were trying to work on his glove, but all that bullshit about him not being able to defend at second base was all bullshit by people who didn't really pay attention. He could play second base fine when he was there. They could have skipped a level with him, and they didn't. We're talking about a guy in his 20s, not a guy in his teens, barely breaking the 20s. They skipped levels with this, not once, but twice. And the only reason why he went back down to AAA is because he lost his confidence, not because he couldn't play. So, yeah, I just this I don't think there were some surprising pieces to his numbers last year, Mike, some to both of us, some maybe a little, but not a lot. I don't think either one of us were shocked. And I think anybody who pays attention to us would agree with that. And I'm not trying to honk our own horn here because there are other people who pay attention to the organization like we do who thought the same thing. I'm just saying, like, this guy could be more than just a flash in the pan 1 year guy since he's never been that. Just me.
Yeah, there's nothing. Anyway, we shouldn't have this conversation. You and I suppose we're doing victory laps for the absurdity, and I think this is a really good conversation about. I think it goes back to talking about guys like Tyler Naquin and other first-round picks, and how you have this sort of pedigree thing, where if just for a second you ignore where the team picked them, and just for a second you observed how the team valued them, moved them, how the team sort of showed trust in their abilities in major situations like a playoff run, I think then you can sort of access, what they're actually valued in the major league organization community rather than what a bunch of dudes who are sitting on their laptops looking at minor league stats are saying about a minor league prospect. So I think it's a really key differentiator, and I hope Indians fans sort of realize that Ramirez is a real lesson in differentiating between people who are fed bogus information and just care about pedigree and people who actually follow the system. But that's narcissistic. I do want to move on to Yandy Diaz. We got to talk about depth before we close. Yeah. There, I think you and I, we've talked about this before. There are small sort of whispers that Yandy Diaz perhaps doesn't like playing third base. He's spent 20-plus games playing center field in the Dominican Winter League. He seems to be preparing for an outfield role more than a third base role, but he's their best depth at third base and probably is big league ready offensively right now. When do we see Diaz?
Okay, I'm just going to say it now. He's going to break camp with the club. And this is a big step for me because Michael Martinez is still coming to camp. So, and I say that kind of jokingly, but I mean, I think we all, while can't fathom Michael Martinez being on this roster, I think that we thought he was gone forever when he went to Boston, and he ended up making the last out of the year. So the fact that they asked him back while they have guys like Yandy Diaz who seem to be ready, I mean, I think the fact that a guy like Michael Martinez makes us look forward to a guy like Eric Gonzalez says it all about Michael Martinez, but I guess I'm veering away from the point. But I think Yandy Diaz offers a lot of that big piece that you've been mentioning all off season, Mike, and that's the contact piece. I mean, he's got a pro-ready bat. His glove at third base, I think, it's one of those interesting things. I watched him play in Carolina the last year I covered the Mudcats, and his glove looked pretty good to me. I think he got voted that year as the best glove at third base in the league. Those things are kind of hit or miss in the minor league system, but his glove looked decent there. I do think he has an above average third base glove. You hear the rumors like I do, Mike, and I think, does he want to play third base? I think he wants to be a big leaguer, and I think when you're eyeballing this Indians roster and you're looking at perhaps the deficiencies they have in the outfield, and perhaps they're missing that one guy that can kind of fill the role that Jose Ramirez filled last year, I think Yandy Diaz is a guy that can do that, and I think he'll be it'll be interesting to see what kind of spring he has and what the Indians ultimately do with him, because the nice thing about him is he can play third, he can play second. He looks like he can play all three outfield positions, which automatically makes him more valuable than, I'm not even going to say it, which makes him pretty valuable. The one thing that he really can't do is play shortstop, but when you have a guy like Jose Ramirez playing third, well, you just slide Ramirez over on those few games that Lindor's not going to play, and you put Diaz there at third base. So I don't know. I mean, I want Diaz on this roster because obviously he can hit. Obviously his bat's probably better than some people think it is, and I think tangibly he brings the floor of our team up when you get rid of a guy. You just put him on the roster and get rid of Michael Martinez. Our team. Is that one win we gained from that? I mean, seriously, and that's not even me, throwing out hyperbole here. So I'm going to go out on a limb, Mike, and say because of roster construct the way it is, I think that a guy like Terry Francona, even with Michael Martinez on the roster, and I chuckle when I say that, I think that he is an enticing player for Francona simply because I think he can play a bunch of positions a little better than he's at least better offensively and just better than Michael Martinez, because Michael Martinez shouldn't play Major League Baseball for anybody, let alone a team that went to the World Series. So I think he makes the club. I mean, I think that his bat's going to show up. I think that he's just a guy that where else are you going to put him? I mean, he's done his time. Let's see what he's got. And you know what? If he doesn't earn it, then they have a few other guys there with some they can play some multiple positions that they can bring up as well, including a guy like Eric Gonzalez. So what are your thoughts, Mike? I mean, I think we've been let down with stuff like this in the past, but last year, Tyler Naquin literally played his way onto the team in spring training. This seems to me like a kind of a ripe position for him to actually make a claim to a roster spot.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people sort of like misconstruct with these sort of minor league call-ups is they don't know really when to consider major league service time and all that jazz. And I think when you have somebody like Diaz, who's 25, going to turn 26 this season, and you have 6+ years of control on a player, the Indians aren't particularly concerned about owning Yandy Diaz when he's 32 years old.
Wait,
so
what?
We'll set that aside.
Are you serious? Wait, you serious? Like, really? Because I keep reading pieces that say they want to control him for that extra year.
That service time. And the sort of like further counter to that, is the Indians have dropped $55 to $60 million on Encarnacion, dropped $5 million on Altuve and Boone Logan. I don't think they're going to let waiting till June get in the way of making their bench really good by adding Yandy Diaz, especially when he's turning 26 this year. I just don't think that's an issue. I don't think service time is an issue in this decision. And, if he adds a lot of value, they'll extend him in a couple of years if they're worried about owning age 32 and 33 seasons, but they're just not. When you look at where those are on the aging curve, and that's not a valued asset to them. So I think you're right, and I think you just talked me into it, and now it makes a lot of sense. So we'll go with Yandy Diaz breaking with the club. Any other depth that we need to have a conversation about? I don't think there's anything significant.
No, I mean, there's Urshela, and there's nothing. I mean, they're typical defensive guys that they bring over, but there really is no depth organizationally at third base. The good news is we got some young guys that are there, and the great news is guys like Diaz, guys like Ramirez, should there be an injury anywhere in the infield, I think we have the guy, other than first base, we have guys that can kind of mold into even a guy like Urshela. If there's an injury, knock on wood, we do have defensive capable players who can come up and kind of fill the role. And as we've noted this offseason, this is a front office that's willing to swing a deal if they have to. So, yeah, I'm feeling really good about this. And I guess my last kind of question as we kind of close shop here, Mike, is there a scenario where the Indians do see more value for Jose Ramirez as that guy that can play multiple positions? Could we see Yandy Diaz as a starting third baseman at some point with Ramirez moving around the infield, perhaps if there's an injury?
I think the more likely thing where Yandy Diaz is the starting third baseman is that Michael Brantley plays 5 games in 2017. I don't think that's entirely unlikely, but I think third base and Diaz and Ramirez are so tied to Michael Brantley's health in 2017, and I just think we have no idea what that's going to look like.
Man, our outfield talk's going to be so much fun.
Certainly. Okay, so while I wrap this up here, you have anything coming out that you want to plug?
Yes, actually, I'm going to come out from the crypt this week, and I'm going to talk about long-term deals for some of our pre-arb guys and our arbitration guys, and even a guy that's got a contract that might be running out soon. So a nice little series, actually 5 or 6 pieces coming out in the next 7 to 10 days. Starting with, guess who? Yeah, Jose Ramirez.
Perfect. I have a piece about Willie Mopena up right now. I mean, it's not particularly exciting. It's Willie Mopena, but what are you going to do? And then I'll have Let's Argue coming out on Tuesday this week with Nam. I think we're going to fight about Lance Stevenson or potentially something incredibly interesting like the Indians lineup being better than the Indians rotation.
How the hell is Lance Stevenson only 26? I thought he was like 40.
I know. These guys who have these sort of like compelling life stories or are compelling characters, they age really fast. Or we argue about them. Like Austin Jackson is like 29 years old, and it feels like we've been arguing about him since I was 10 years old.
Well, I guess that's what happens when you become Twitter fodder.
Indeed. Well, that's it for this Positional Preview podcast. Jim will be anchoring the next one. It will be far more compelling. It will be the shortstop version. Thank you for listening, and subscribe and hang out at WFNY.com.
Peace.
Have a good night, everybody.